Spring 1944, Kansas, United States. Over 400,000 Axis prisoners of war were held on American soil during World War II. 51,000 of them Italian soldiers captured in the North African campaigns. The government's farm labor program aimed to fill the shortage of agricultural workers while keeping the prisoners busy and productive. The humiliation would be complete, or so Giovanni Bellucci expected, as the heavy chains were removed from his wrists in the middle of Kansas's golden fields. 3 months earlier, he had marched under the Italian flag through Tunisia. Now he carried only the shame of defeat and the weight of uncertainty. The story of Italian prisoners of war expected humiliation until they discovered America's surprising hospitality would become one no military manual had prepared to tell. Samuel Whitaker watched in silence, holding a worn straw hat and a decision that would change everything. The train gave one last whistle before Giovanni Bellucci stepped onto American soil, the sound echoing across the endless fields like a lament of iron. His military boots, still covered with the red dust of Tunisia, touched the weathered wood of the haze. Kansas platform as the wind carried the sweet, earthy scent of ripening wheat. Around him, 17 other Italian soldiers lowered their heads, carrying ragged packs and the invisible weight of defeat. Giovanni studied the American guards escorting them. Young men with serious faces, but without the cruelty he had expected to find in the eyes of victors. The May morning painted the horizon in golden tones, and for the first time in months, Giovanni felt something beyond fear. Confusion, perhaps even a spark of curiosity. What would these Americans do with enemy soldiers on their sacred land? They were led down a dirt road that cut through sprawling farmland, where red barns dotted the landscape like markers of a civilization Giovanni had never imagined. The smell of cattle and fresh hay mingled with the fragrance of wildflowers along the fences, creating an olfactory symphony that clashed sharply with the lingering odors of gunpowder and blood haunting his memories. The white-painted wooden houses looked like something from an American dream the fascist propaganda had tried to demonize, but now appeared simple and welcoming. Children ran through the yards, pausing to wave shyly at the passing foreigners, while women hung colorful clothes on lines that danced in the breeze. Giovanni absent-mindedly touched the St. Christopher medal his mother had sewn into his uniform, feeling the cool metal against his warm skin. Could this strange land be the place where he would find redemption, or only a new kind of captivity? Samuel Whitaker leaned against the fence of his property as he spotted the cloud of dust raised by the military trucks. His calloused hands gripped a coffee cup that had gone cold while he waited, watching the wheat fields ripple like a golden sea beneath the morning sun. Widowed for 3 years, he had lost 2 of his sons in the Pacific War, and now relied only on Emily, his 16-year-old daughter, to help him keep the farm from failing for lack of hands. The government program using prisoners of war for farm work had come to him as a last hope, though Samuel knew many neighbors viewed the idea with suspicion and even hostility. He sipped the bitter coffee and sighed, feeling the weight of the responsibility he was about to take on. These men had been his son's enemies, yet they were also someone else's sons, and Samuel had learned through loss and loneliness that war claimed victims on every side. The rough texture of the fence beneath his hands reminded him of the values his father had taught him: hard work, justice, and above all, compassion. Emily Whitaker watched from the kitchen window, drying her hands on an apron that had belonged to her mother, as the trucks approached along the dusty road. Her 16 years had been marked by grief and early responsibility, but her natural curiosity remained intact, nourished by letters arriving from American soldiers scattered across the world. She had studied Italian in school for 2 years, fascinated by the music of the language and the stories of art and culture her teacher, Miss Henderson, told with contagious passion. The aroma of homemade bread wafting from the oven mingled with the nervousness growing in her chest, creating a strange blend of anticipation and apprehension. Emily had heard the spiteful comments in town about feeding the enemy and treating criminals like guests, but something inside her rejected such cruel simplicity. She touched the photograph of her brothers in the frame on the kitchen table, feeling the smooth glass beneath trembling fingers. Perhaps, she thought, It was possible to discover that even enemies carried human stories worth hearing. The rumble of engines grew louder, bringing the promise of changes that would transform not only the farm, but also the hearts of everyone involved. The truck stopped at the main gate of the Whitaker farm, raising a cloud of dust that took long seconds to settle. Giovanni was the first to climb down, followed by the other prisoners who lined up in disciplined formation, maintaining military bearing even on enemy soil. The American officer in charge, a gray-mustached lieutenant named Morrison, approached Samuel with papers in hand and a respectful handshake. "These men are under your supervision during working hours, Mr. Whitaker," he said in a firm but not hostile voice. "They'll return to the POW camp every night. But during the day, they're your workers." Samuel nodded, studying the sun-browned faces of the Italians who avoided his gaze. Some far too young to bear so many invisible scars. The smell of sweat mixed with the metallic odor of worn uniforms created a heavy atmosphere. But Samuel sensed something subtler. The familiar scent of men who knew hard work. Giovanni finally raised his eyes and met the calm blue gaze of Samuel Whitaker, surprised not to find hatred or contempt there, only careful appraisal, and perhaps a trace of understanding. The first work order sounded almost like an invitation. "You'll help with the wheat harvest," Samuel said in slow English, gesturing toward the golden fields stretching as far as the eye could see. Giovanni translated quickly into Italian, noticing how his native words felt oddly out of place in this American setting. The group was led to the barn, where farm tools waited in neat rows, sharp scythes, wicker baskets, and leather gloves still scented with treatment oil. Emily appeared at the barn door carrying a tray with jars of cold water and metal cups, her face flushed from the morning heat and her own shyness. "Buongiorno," she said hesitantly, pronouncing the Italian greeting with an accent that drew surprised smiles from the prisoners. Giovanni felt something stir in his chest. It was the first time in months that someone had spoken his native language without interrogating or threatening him. The cool texture of the metal cup against his dry lips brought not only physical relief, but an emotional one as well. As he drank the crystal-clear water, Giovanni looked around the farm and realized that perhaps, just perhaps, war had reserved a surprise no military strategy could have predicted. The sun had already climbed a hand's breadth in the sky when Giovanni gripped his first American scythe, feeling the different weight of the tool in hands calloused by war. The wooden handle was smooth from decades of use, polished by the palms of generations who had worked this same land under the same infinite sky. Around him, the other prisoners spread across the fields following Samuel's instructions, as he personally demonstrated the correct technique for cutting the wheat without wasting precious grain. The rhythmic swish of the blades slicing the stalks created a rural music Giovanni had never imagined could be so hypnotic. Marco Antonelli, a 19-year-old soldier from Naples, worked beside him, whispering nervous remarks about the strangeness of the situation. "It's a trap," he muttered between swings of the scythe. "No enemy treats prisoners like this." Giovanni did not answer, concentrating on the unfamiliar feeling of producing instead of destroying. But some secret part of him was beginning to suspect that Marco might be wrong. The sweet fragrance of ripe grain mingled with the earthy scent of freshly turned soil, awakening childhood memories of his hometown in Tuscany. Emily watched the Italian workers from the house porch, pretending to fold laundry while studying their movements and expressions. There was something familiar in the way they handled the tools, an instinctive competence that spoke of a connection to the land that transcended nationality. She noticed particularly Giovanni, whose upright posture and precise movements suggested a natural leader, even in captivity. During the mid-morning break, Emily gathered enough courage to approach the group with a new tray of water, this time accompanied by generous slices of still-warm homemade bread. "Pain," she said in hesitant Italian, offering the pieces to the surprised men. The aroma of yeast and baked wheat brought expressions of nostalgia to their sun-browned faces, and Giovanni saw discreet tears in the eyes of some of his companions. "Grazie," he replied softly, pronouncing the word with an emotion he hadn't felt in months. Emily smiled shyly and murmured that the recipe had come from her grandmother, who had also been an immigrant. The soft texture of the bread against his parched palate gave Giovanni a sense of comfort he had forgotten existed. In that moment, looking at the young and sincere face of the American girl, Giovanni realized that perhaps the war hadn't stolen all the world's goodness. Samuel worked side by side with the prisoners, sweating under the same sun, and feeling the same fatigue tightening his muscles at the end of each row of cut wheat. He discreetly observed how they naturally organized themselves into efficient teams, with Giovanni assuming the role of coordinator without anyone asking him to. There was a respectful discipline in their movements, but also a deep sadness Samuel recognized from his own grief after the deaths of his sons. During a water break, he approached Giovanni and pointed to the faded photograph the Italian carried in his shirt pocket. "Familia?" Samuel asked, using one of the few Italian words he knew. Giovanni nodded and showed the picture. A beautiful woman with two small boys, all smiling beneath a Mediterranean sun of happier times. Samuel took his own wallet and revealed a photo of his sons in military uniform, killed in the Pacific 6 months earlier. For a moment, the two men looked at each other in silence, acknowledging the shared pain that war had planted in their hearts. The wind whispered through the ripened wheat, carrying the echo of laments shed by both Americans and Italians. Samuel reached out and briefly touched Giovanni's shoulder, feeling the rough texture of the faded military uniform, yet conveying through that simple gesture a solidarity that needed no translation. Lunch was served in the shade of the barn, where Samuel had improvised a long table from planks and sawhorses. Emily brought steaming pots of beef stew with potatoes, accompanied by more fresh bread and homemade butter that melted at the touch. The prisoners sat down hesitantly, still unbelieving they would be treated like regular workers rather than war criminals. Giovanni watched Samuel bow his head in silent prayer before beginning to eat, and instinctively made the sign of the cross, followed by the other Italians. The shared religious gesture created an invisible bridge between different cultures, united by the same faith and essential humanity. The rich flavor of the stew awakened appetites dulled by months of bland military food, and Giovanni felt his stomach relax for the first time since his capture. Emily served generous second helpings whenever she noticed an empty plate, her initial shyness giving way to a natural hospitality that shone in her blue eyes. "My mother always said good food cures any sorrow," she remarked in English, then translated in rudimentary Italian that drew genuine smiles from the men. The creamy texture of the potatoes and the richness of the well-seasoned meat created a sense of abundance that starkly contrasted with the deprivation everyone had expected that morning. By afternoon, as the work continued beneath the stronger sun, Giovanni noticed how Samuel never set himself above them, working with the same intensity and sharing the burden of labor equally. There was a dignity in manual work that military life had never taught him to value, a simple satisfaction in seeing the fields harvested in orderly, efficient rows. Marco Antonelli had relaxed considerably since morning, humming soft Neapolitan tunes that blended harmoniously with the sound of the wind through the fields. Other prisoners quietly joined the improvised chorus, creating a soundtrack both melancholy and beautiful that floated over the golden wheat. Samuel paused for a moment to listen, recognizing in the Italian music the same longing he felt when he heard the gospel hymns his wife had once sung. Emily appeared at the edge of the field with a violin that had belonged to her youngest brother, and began to play a simple melody that merged perfectly with the Italian voices. The music created a magical atmosphere that temporarily suspended the realities of war, turning that American field into a neutral ground where only art and humanity mattered. Giovanni felt his throat tighten with emotions he could not name, while the rough texture of wheat stalks between his fingers connected him physically to a land that was beginning to feel less foreign with every passing hour. The day ended with the sunset painting the fields in deep gold, as the last loads of wheat were hauled to the barn in wooden wagons that creaked melodiously. Giovanni wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand, observing the tangible result of his labor, neatly stacked piles of grain that would feed American families through the winter, produced by Italian soldiers who only hours earlier had expected humiliation and cruelty. Samuel approached him with 2 mugs of hot coffee Emily had prepared. offering one to the prisoner of war, as if to a business partner. "Good work," he said simply, and Giovanni understood the praise even without mastering the language. The coffee's strong, full-bodied flavor warmed not only his tired body, but something deeper within his chest. As the military trucks arrived to take them back to the prison camp, Giovanni looked one last time at the farm that had been the setting for his first experience of dignity in months. The smooth surface of the still warm metal mug in his hands symbolized a hospitality that defied everything propaganda had taught him about the American enemy. That night, as he was taken back to confinement, Giovanni carried with him the seed of a discovery that would forever change his understanding of war. Humanity and the possibility of redemption even in the darkest moments of history. The second week brought a routine Giovanni had never imagined could be comforting in captivity. Each morning, the military trucks dropped them at the Whitaker farm with military punctuality, but the faces that greeted them were no longer strangers. Samuel always waited in the same spot, leaning on the fence with his morning cup of coffee, waving with a simple gesture that had become a silent welcome ritual. The smell of bacon frying in the main house's kitchen drifted across the fields, mixing with the fresh fragrance of grass, still wet with dawn's dew. Giovanni had begun waking in the prison camp with a strange feeling that took days to identify. It was anticipation, something he hadn't felt since before the war. His companions showed subtle changes as well. Marco Antonelli had stopped muttering about traps and betrayals, and some of the younger soldiers had started to smile when Emily appeared with her food trays and increasingly successful attempts to speak Italian. The sound of morning birds created a natural symphony that accompanied their steps from the gate to the fields, and Giovanni discovered he could identify different species by their songs, an ability he had developed in his Tuscan childhood and rediscovered in those American mornings. Samuel had started teaching English words during water breaks, pointing to objects and repeating their names with a teacher's patience. "Wheat," he would say, holding a handful of golden grain. "Trigo," Giovanni replied, offering the Italian translation that Samuel repeated with growing care. That simple language exchange naturally expanded to include other prisoners, creating improvised lessons that became genuine moments of connection among men who technically remained wartime enemies. During one of these sessions, Samuel showed an old photo of his German immigrant parents, explaining with gestures and simple words how they had come to Kansas at the end of the previous century, in search of a better life. "Immigration," he said, touching the faded image. "Immigrazione," Giovanni repeated, suddenly understanding that American land had been built by people like him, foreigners in search of hope. The rough texture of the yellowed photograph stirred memories of Giovanni's own family, generations of Tuscan peasants who had worked vineyards with the same dedication he now applied to Kansas wheat fields. Emily often joined these lessons. Her youth and enthusiasm for language breaking down barriers adults took longer to lower, creating a relaxed environment where mispronunciations sparked shared laughter rather than embarrassment. The work had taken on an almost meditative rhythm, allowing Giovanni to process thoughts and emotions the turmoil of war had suppressed for years. While his hands moved automatically, cutting wheat and bundling sheaves, his mind wandered through memories of Tuscany, sunlit vineyards under the Mediterranean sky, the sound of his village church bells, the smell of bread baking in his grandmother's stone oven. Curiously, those memories no longer brought only painful nostalgia. They began to blend with present sensations, the earthy aroma of Kansas fields, the American wind whispering through the heads of grain, the familiar feel of farm work that connected his Italian heritage to his current reality. One particularly hot afternoon, as Giovanni rested in the barn's shade, Samuel approached carrying 2 cold beers beaded with condensation. "For the heat," he said simply, offering a bottle to the Italian prisoner. The refreshing taste of American beer, different but not unpleasant compared to the wines of his homeland, symbolized an acceptance that went far beyond mere tolerance. They drank in comfortable silence, 2 men joined by shared fatigue and a growing understanding that humanity could flourish even in the most unlikely contexts. The cold liquid sliding down his dry throat gave Giovanni a sense of belonging he hadn't felt since leaving his village to join the Italian army. Emily had become an informal cultural bridge between Italian and American worlds, carrying books on Italian history borrowed from the school library, and asking questions that showed genuine curiosity about the culture of their temporary workers. During a lunch break, she brought a map of Italy and asked Giovanni to show his hometown, watching with fascination as he pointed to a small region in Tuscany and described, in Italian mixed with rudimentary English, the vine-covered hills where he had grown up. "Beautiful," Emily murmured, tracing the lines that marked the distant geography with her finger. Giovanni felt an unexpected pride seeing his homeland through the admiring eyes of the young American, realizing that war had temporarily obscured his ability to value the beauty of his own origins. She also brought photographs of Italian monuments she had found in school books: the Colosseum, the Leaning Tower of Pisa, the canals of Venice. For each image, Giovanni offered comments and personal stories, weaving narratives that turned distant tourist landmarks into real places inhabited by real people with real lives. The smooth texture of the book pages beneath his calloused fingers contrasted with the roughness of manual labor. Yet both experiences fed an emotional education that was fundamentally changing his perspective on enemies, allies, and the complex nature of human identity. Marco Antonelli, initially skeptical of any fraternization with Americans, had begun contributing to these improvised cultural sessions, sharing Neapolitan songs and teaching Emily a few words in his region's musical dialect. The relationship between Samuel and Giovanni had evolved beyond simple work cooperation, growing into a friendship based on mutual respect and a shared understanding of the losses the war had imposed on both. During quieter moments in the fields, Samuel had begun sharing stories about his dead sons, describing their distinct personalities and the dreams they had nurtured before leaving for the war. Giovanni responded with tales of his own family in Italy, his wife, Maria, who worked at the village school, and his two small sons who played among the vines while he labored. These personal exchanges created an emotional intimacy that transcended language and cultural barriers, revealing the universality of a father's pain and the longing that marked men on both sides of the conflict. One afternoon, Samuel brought his harmonica to the field and played a few American folk melodies that echoed melancholically over the golden acres. Giovanni borrowed the instrument and blew a few notes of a Tuscan song his mother used to hum while making dinner. The harmonica's sweet metallic sound carried emotions words could not express, creating a musical conversation that spoke directly to the wounded hearts of two fathers who had lost so much to war. The cool metal against his lips gave Giovanni a tangible connection to the American soul, just as the Italian melody played on Samuel's instrument formed a sonic bridge between their cultures. In that moment, under Kansas's infinite sky, national borders seemed absurdly artificial compared to the solid reality of the human connection blooming between them. By the end of the third week, a subtle yet noticeable change had settled over the Whitaker farm. The Italian prisoners were no longer forced laborers supervised by a wary American farmer. They had become a cohesive team united by common goals and mutual respect. Giovanni watched this transformation with a mix of admiration and melancholy, knowing the war would eventually end, and these unlikely bonds would be tested by geopolitical realities beyond his control. Emily had begun studying Italian with impressive seriousness, practicing during meals, and surprising the workers with increasingly sophisticated grammar. "Voglio imparare tutto," she declared one afternoon, her desire to learn everything about Italian culture expressed with a sincerity that deeply moved Giovanni. Samuel had set up an improvised ping-pong table in the barn, using a wide plank and a rope net, creating a recreation spot where Americans and Italians competed good-naturedly during longer breaks. The rhythmic ping of the ball mixed with laughter in two languages, composing a soundtrack of camaraderie that would have seemed impossible only weeks earlier. Giovanni touched the St. Christopher medal on his chest, feeling the metal warmed by the American sun, and said a silent prayer of gratitude for discovering that even in the most unlikely circumstances, human kindness could flourish like golden wheat in fertile soil. That night, as he returned to the prison camp, Giovanni carried with him the certainty that he had found something precious and unexpected on that Kansas farm. Proof that war, however destructive, could not eradicate humanity's capacity for understanding, forgiveness, and love. June arrived with waves of heat that made the air shimmer above the ripening fields, but it also brought the nearness of the harvest's end, and a growing melancholy everyone felt, yet no one voiced aloud. Giovanni had developed the habit of waking a few minutes before the camp alarm, using those silent moments to prepare his heart for another day at the Whitaker farm, knowing that each dawn drew him closer to the conclusion of a life-changing experience. The smell of strong coffee that Emily brewed each morning had become more than a cue for physical awakening. It was a kind of spiritual awakening, one that was quietly reshaping his understanding of enmity and friendship. Samuel had begun to work more slowly, not from age or fatigue, but because he sensed instinctively that haste would shorten the precious time left with these men who had become far more than temporary laborers. The morning bird sang with special intensity during those final weeks, as if nature itself were celebrating the improbable harmony that had blossomed on that piece of American soil. Marco Antonelli confided to Giovanni that he dreamed every night of the farm, waking with a yearning for a place he should technically consider enemy territory, yet which had become the setting for his most cherished memories since the war began. The familiar feel of farm tools in his hands now signified comfort and purpose, a dramatic contrast to the cold weight of the weapons he had once carried across Africa's battlefields. Emily had become strikingly fluent in conversational Italian, surprising even Giovanni, with her ability to capture emotional nuance in a language she had learned in only a few weeks of practical immersion. During water breaks, she led increasingly sophisticated conversations about literature, music, and philosophy, displaying an intellectual maturity beyond her 16 years. La guerra cambia tutto, she said one afternoon, her blue eyes seeming older than her age. Ma anche rivela chi siamo veramente. Her observation, that war changes everything but also reveals who we truly are, touched Giovanni deeply, for it perfectly captured his own journey of self-discovery in those Kansas fields. She had begun documenting the Italian prisoners' stories in an illustrated journal, sketching their faces and recording their personal histories with the care of a dedicated anthropologist. The soft scratch of her pen on paper during rest breaks became a gentle soundtrack to the intimate confessions the soldiers shared about their distant families. Giovanni watched in fascination as Emily captured not only each man's physical likeness, but something essential of their personalities in her delicate lines and carefully observed expressions. The rough texture of the journal's paper beneath her young fingers symbolized a conscious effort to preserve memories they all knew would be precious decades later, when the war was only history, and these moments of shared humanity might seem like a distant dream. Samuel organized a special celebration for the harvest's final weekend, transforming the barn into an improvised dance hall with simple but thoughtful decorations. He borrowed an accordion from a neighbor who played music and invited several local families who had overcome their initial prejudice about mingling with prisoners of war. The aroma of special roasts Emily had prepared over 2 days mingled with the fragrance of wildflowers she had gathered to decorate the makeshift tables. Giovanni dressed in his cleanest shirt and helped arrange chairs in circles that encouraged conversation among groups who, only weeks earlier, would have considered each other irreconcilable enemies. The music began shyly, with Samuel playing American folk tunes on the borrowed accordion, but soon grew into a spontaneous cultural festival, where Italians sang popular opera songs and Americans answered with gospel hymns. Marco Antonelli had brought a harmonica borrowed from another prisoner, adding layered harmonies that turned the rustic barn into an impromptu concert hall. The mingled voices, melodic Italian intertwined with the measured cadence of English, created a human symphony celebrating not only the end of the harvest, but the discovery that music, like humanity, recognizes no national borders. The smooth keys of the accordion beneath Samuel's fingers contrasted with the roughness of his life as a farmer. Yet both experiences contributed to a richer understanding of the beauty that can emerge when different people unite in a common purpose. During the celebration, Giovanni found a private moment with Samuel on the house porch, where they watched the sunset paint the freshly harvested fields in deep gold. 2 cups of coffee steamed gently in the warm Kansas air, their fragrant clouds dissolving quickly in the evening breeze. "You change my perspective on many things," Samuel said in careful English, knowing Giovanni understood more than he could yet reply. "Anche tu," Giovanni answered in Italian, adding in hesitant English, "You, good man, good father." The exchange of sincere compliments sealed a friendship both men knew transcended the circumstances of their meeting, rooted in fundamental values that would endure long after the war ended and their lives went separate ways. Samuel pulled from his pocket a small wooden crucifix he had carved during the long nights after his sons' deaths, offering it to Giovanni as a symbol of a shared faith strengthened through their unlikely bond. Giovanni accepted the gift reverently, feeling the smooth polish of the wood against his palm, and in return offered his own St. Christopher medal, which he had carried through the entire African campaign. The symbolic weight of exchanging personal religious tokens represented a trust and affection no diplomatic treaty could have created. Emily joined them on the porch, bringing a photograph she had secretly taken of the entire group working together in the fields, a snapshot of harmonious cooperation that perfectly captured the extraordinary transformation of that Kansas summer. "So you will never forget," she said in flawless Italian, handing copies of the photograph to both Giovanni and her father. The morning of departure arrived with a heavy silence that starkly contrasted with the weeks of cheerful work and growing camaraderie. The military trucks waited at the farm gate, somber reminders that this extraordinary experience had always been temporary, bounded by the larger realities of a world war beyond any participant's control. Giovanni packed his few personal belongings, Emily's photograph, Samuel's crucifix, a handful of letters he had written to his family during work breaks, into his worn military backpack, each object laden with memories he knew he would preserve for the rest of his life. Samuel and Emily waited near the house, both visibly struggling against emotions threatening to spill into tears they did not wish to shed publicly. The familiar morning aroma of coffee still drifted from the kitchen, but now it carried an anticipatory nostalgia that made each breath painfully precious. Marco Antonelli and the other prisoners said individual goodbyes to Emily, each receiving a heartfelt hug and a few carefully rehearsed words of encouragement in Italian. The sound of the truck engines idling created an urgent soundtrack that hurried a farewell everyone wished to prolong. Giovanni was the last to approach the Whitaker family, carrying in his chest a gratitude he knew he could never fully express in any language. The rough calluses of his work-hardened hands contrasted with the softness of Emily's as she held them for a final moment, whispering a promise in Italian that she would always remember the lessons in humanity she had learned through his example. "Arrivederci, amici," Giovanni said at last, using the formal Italian farewell that felt inadequate for the depth of the moment, but was the only phrase he could utter without his voice breaking completely. Samuel extended his hand in a firm grip that naturally turned into a fraternal embrace, two men bound by the shared experience of loss, labor, and the discovery of a common humanity. Emily handed Giovanni a sealed envelope containing a letter she had written in Italian the night before, asking him to read it only when he arrived back at the prison camp. The paper crackled softly between his fingers as he carefully tucked the letter into the inner pocket of his jacket, close to the heart that had been transformed by this unexpected American experience. As he walked toward the military trucks, Giovanni turned one last time to fix in memory the image of the Whitaker farm, the red barn, the newly harvested golden fields, the White House with its welcoming porch, and most of all, the two figures waving in the distance who had taught him that enemies could become family when humanity was chosen over hate. The sound of rubber tires on gravel marked the physical end of his stay on the farm, but Giovanni knew something fundamental had changed within him, a seed of hope and understanding that would grow and flourish through all the decades of his life. On that farewell morning, as Kansas faded behind the fogged window of the military truck, Giovanni Bellucci carried with him an unshakable certainty that he had witnessed a small but genuine miracle, proof that even in the most unlikely circumstances, love can triumph over fear, understanding over prejudice, and humanity over war. The months that followed in the prison camp passed like a gray haze punctuated by golden moments of memory that Giovanni obsessively relived during the long, monotonous nights. He had read Emily's letter dozens of times, memorizing every carefully constructed Italian word in which she described how the prisoners had changed her perspective on war, humanity, and the possibility of true peace between different peoples. The pages, yellowed from constant handling, had become his most precious treasure, a tangible talisman proving that those days on the Whitaker farm had not been merely a feverish dream born of the despair of captivity. Marco Antonelli had developed the habit of sitting beside Giovanni during the camp's Spartan meals, whispering shared memories about the taste of Emily's homemade bread and the comforting feel of honest work under the Kansas sun. Other prisoners, initially skeptical of the American stories Giovanni and his companions told, began to show growing curiosity about a country that had managed to turn enemies into respected workers. The sound of rain against the barracks' wooden walls created a melancholy soundtrack for these reminiscing sessions, where men far from home found emotional comfort through shared memories of unexpected kindness. The metallic fragrance of damp air mingled with the odor of confined male bodies, but Giovanni had learned to focus on the sweeter scent memories, the aroma of morning coffee, the perfume of wildflowers in the fields, the earthy smell of fertile soil between his fingers during the harvest. The coarse texture of military blankets against his skin contrasted painfully with the softness of his memories of American hospitality, creating a constant tension between his present reality and the future hopes born in that transformative summer. Giovanni completed his journal on the Whitaker farm experience, creating a document of more than 200 pages detailing not only factual events but also psychological analyses of how authentic human interactions could overcome entrenched national and ideological prejudices. He began teaching basic English to other prisoners using the vocabulary and phrases he had learned during farm work, establishing an informal school that prepared his compatriots for possible future interactions with Americans in commercial or diplomatic contexts. The sound of language lessons echoed through the barracks on hot afternoons, mixing hesitant Italian accents with English words that carried memories of dignity and mutual respect. Marco Antonelli had become Giovanni's unofficial assistant in these educational activities, contributing his own farm memories to illustrate grammatical and cultural points that made learning more meaningful and emotionally resonant. The fragrance of paper and ink that filled these study sessions evoked memories of Emily's letters and the photographs documenting their American experience, creating sensory connections that made the educational process more visceral and memorable. Through official channels, Samuel had sent a formal proposal to establish a post-war agricultural exchange program that would allow young Italians to study American cultivation techniques while offering Americans opportunities to learn traditional European methods of viticulture and sustainable farming. The texture of the wheat seeds Giovanni had secretly saved from his last harvest on the Whitaker farm symbolized not only precious memories but also future possibilities of literally and metaphorically planting the seeds of mutual understanding that had sprouted during that transformative summer of 1944. In those final weeks on American soil, Giovanni felt simultaneously eager to return to his family in Tuscany and reluctant to leave the country that had taught him fundamental lessons about humanity, forgiveness, and the heart's boundless capacity to overcome the artificial divisions created by war and national politics. The repatriation ship cut through the gray waters of the Atlantic in September 1945, carrying hundreds of former Italian prisoners returning to a homeland ravaged by war and occupation. But Giovanni Bellucci remained on deck watching the horizon where America slowly faded, carrying in his heart a complex mix of gratitude for regained freedom and deep longing for the Whitaker family, who had redefined his concept of enemy and ally. The rhythmic sound of the waves against the ship's metal hull created a hypnotic soundtrack to his reflections on how to explain to his wife and children the inner transformations he had undergone on foreign soil. Marco Antonelli stood beside him, the two sharing a contemplative silence as they watched the seabirds trailing the ship, tracing aerial patterns that recalled the birds in the Kansas fields, the soundtrack of productive mornings and afternoons of cultural discovery. The salty fragrance of the ocean mingled with the aromas of Italian food rising from the lower decks, where hundreds of men quietly celebrated the end of years of captivity and uncertainty. Giovanni touched Samuel's wooden crucifix at his neck, feeling the smooth, familiar texture that had become a talisman of hope during the hard months waiting for repatriation. His civilian clothes, provided by the American Red Cross, still carried the clean, fresh scent of American soaps, evoking memories of personal dignity rediscovered through honest work and mutual respect. In his limited luggage, Giovanni carried treasures worth more than gold: photographs of the Whitaker farm, Emily's letters written in careful Italian, Kansas wheat seeds meticulously preserved in small envelopes, and his detailed journal recording one of the most transformative experiences of his life. The texture of the pages, yellowed by the tears he had shed while writing, symbolized not only historical record, but also emotional preparation for the challenge of conveying transcendent experiences to people who had not shared his singular journey through the heart of rural America. The port of Naples emerged from the Mediterranean horizon like a sight both familiar and strangely distant, its war ruins starkly contrasting with the memories of American rural prosperity that Giovanni carried as reference points for possible reconstruction. Crowds of Italian families waited on the pier, faces etched by years of deprivation and anxiety, yet lit by the joy of reunions many had feared would never come. Giovanni searched among the hundreds of people for the beloved faces he had pictured in dreams during homesick nights in the prison camp, his heart pounding as he realized he was about to see his family after 2 years of separation and change. The sound of Italian voices shouting names and greetings created an emotional cacophony that contrasted with the quiet of the Kansas fields, yet awakened a deep nostalgia for family bonds that had sustained his sanity during the hardest stretches of captivity. Maria appeared in the crowd like an apparition, thinner and with slightly grayer hair, but with the same dark eyes that had haunted his dreams and fueled his determination to survive. Their 2 sons, now visibly taller and more mature, ran toward the gangway with cries of "Papa" that rang over the harbor like heavenly music, the familiar feel of his wife's hands against his bearded face, the lavender scent that had always clung to her hair, the weight of his children's bodies hugging his legs. All these sensations created an emotional overload that briefly erased the complexities of his American experience. Marco Antonelli was greeted by his Neapolitan mother, a small but strong woman who wept uncontrollably as she touched her son's face, as if verifying his physical reality. The fragrance of homemade Italian food rising from the baskets families had brought mingled with portside smells of fish and sea salt, creating an olfactory symphony that definitively marked Giovanni's return to the world he had left behind as a young, naive soldier. The train ride from Naples to his Tuscan village gave Giovanni time to observe an Italy devastated by war, but beginning the slow reconstruction that would take decades to complete. Through the car's fogged windows, he saw abandoned fields, destroyed bridges, bombed cities where families lived in makeshift ruins, painfully contrasting with the orderly, prosperous landscapes he had stored in memory from the Whitaker farm. Maria held his hand constantly as if afraid he might vanish again, while their sons peppered him with questions about prison, America, and the extraordinary stories they had only partly gleaned from his censored letters. Giovanni cautiously began to share some of his American experiences, noting the incredulity and fascination on his family's faces as he described the Whitakers' kindness and the dignified working conditions he had found in territory technically belonging to the enemy. The sound of the train over war-damaged rails created an irregular rhythm that mirrored the difficulty of returning to normalities permanently altered by years of conflict and separation. His American clothes, clean and well-tailored, drew curious looks from other passengers in patched, threadbare garments, forcing an uncomfortable awareness of the economic disparities between countries that he had witnessed firsthand. The coarse texture of the Italian train seats contrasted with visceral memories of the relative comfort he had known even as a prisoner of war on American soil, stirring complex reflections on living standards, economic systems, and opportunities that his transatlantic experience had made impossible to ignore. Giovanni held the envelope of Kansas wheat seeds, imagining what it would be like to plant those American grains in Tuscan soil, and to explain to his neighboring farmers the advanced techniques he had learned during that transformative summer of international agricultural collaboration. Arrival in his Tuscan village was marked by an improvised community celebration that revealed both genuine joy at the return of a local son and intense curiosity about experiences in distant lands most villagers knew only from propaganda or rumor. Giovanni walked the stone streets he had known since childhood, noting war damage patched together with improvisation, but also signs of resilience and rebirth that spoke to the extraordinary tenacity of the Italian people. His family home, smaller than memory suggested, was intact and welcoming, with the same sense of rosemary and thyme from his mother's garden mingling with the aromas of homemade dishes Maria had prepared for days in anticipation of his return. The familiar sound of the local church, bells pealing in celebration, created a sacred soundtrack marking not only his physical return but also a kind of symbolic resurrection after years of uncertainty about his survival. Neighbors and relatives gathered in the small yard, bringing bottles of homemade wine hidden during the German occupation, and traditional dishes prepared with ingredients precious in the years of rationing. Giovanni was bombarded with questions about America, prison, work, and especially about the stories that challenged the negative stereotypes of Americans fascist propaganda had promoted during the war. The familiar feel of the old stone under his bare feet brought back childhood memories that mingled oddly with recent recollections of the polished wooden floors in the Whitaker's house, creating a temporal overlap that symbolized his expanded, culturally hybrid identity. He showed photographs of the Kansas farm, noting expressions of admiration and disbelief as he described Samuel and Emily's generosity, the dignity of farm work, and the hospitality he had received from people who theoretically should have hated him as a wartime enemy. Marco Antonelli reached his own family in Naples with similar stories, and through letters Giovanni learned that other veterans of the American experience faced comparable challenges as they tried to convey personal transformations that transcended conventional categories of patriotism, national loyalty, and cultural identity. The first months of readjustment to Italian civilian life brought emotional and psychological challenges Giovanni had not fully anticipated in his eagerness to come home. He discovered that his views on agriculture, economics, politics, and international relations had been fundamentally altered by his American experience, creating subtle yet persistent tensions with local traditions and attitudes he had previously accepted unquestioningly. His attempts to implement American farming techniques in the family vineyards met resistance from neighbors who saw foreign methods as a betrayal of ancestral traditions, forcing Giovanni to navigate carefully between innovation and respect for local culture. Maria observed the changes in her husband with a blend of admiration and concern, recognizing that he had returned fundamentally different, more reflective and cosmopolitan, but also at times melancholy and distant. The sound of letters arriving from the United States always set the household astir, especially when Emily wrote in Italian about her university studies and plans to visit Italy when finances allowed. Giovanni had begun offering English lessons to village youth, using his American letters and Whitaker farm photographs as teaching materials, an informal school that planted seeds of interest in international opportunities. The fragrance of the American wheat seeds he had experimentally planted on a small plot, mixed with the traditional aromas of Tuscan vineyards, literally symbolizing the cultural hybridization he sought in his personal life. The familiar feel of Italian farm tools contrasted with visceral memories of the American tools he had used on the Whitaker farm, prompting constant comparisons that sometimes made him feel as if he lived in two worlds at once. Samuel had sent a Christmas parcel containing American chocolates, agricultural magazines, and an enlarged photograph of the barn, where they had shared so many moments of mutual discovery. Gifts Giovanni displayed proudly, even as they stirred a deep longing for connections that felt irretrievably distant in time and space. The spring of 1946 brought not only the natural rebirth of Tuscan vineyards, but also concrete opportunities for Giovanni to begin building lasting bridges between his Italian and American experiences through community initiatives honoring both cultures. He had established regular correspondence with other Italian veterans who had worked on American farms, creating an informal network of men who shared similar perspectives on international cooperation and reconstruction based on mutual understanding rather than nationalist revenge. Marco Antonelli visited Tuscany during leave from his new job at a reconstituted factory in Naples, bringing stories of other former prisoners facing similar challenges of readjustment and of integrating American experiences into traditional Italian lives. Giovanni had begun writing a book about his time on the Whitaker farm, expanding his personal journal into a narrative he hoped eventually to publish as a contribution to post-war literature of reconciliation and international understanding. The sound of his borrowed typewriter echoed through Tuscan nights, its mechanical rhythms accompanying his literary reconstruction of memories that grew more precious and meaningful with time. Emily had written that she was studying Italian literature at university and planning to write her own dissertation on cultural interactions in POW work programs, creating a transatlantic academic collaboration that validated the historical significance of their shared experiences. The rough texture of the growing manuscript's pages symbolized not only the preservation of personal memories, but also an active contribution to national and international conversations about reconstruction, forgiveness, and the possibility of building more humane futures from the rubble of past conflicts. Samuel had written a long letter describing his own reflections on how the experience with Italian workers had changed his perspectives on agriculture, community, and international responsibility, suggesting the transformation had been mutual, and that Americans, too, had learned valuable lessons about hospitality, dignity, and strength through cultural diversity. The fragrance of almond blossoms beginning to flower in his vineyards mingled with the scents of American letters arriving monthly, creating an olfactory symphony that celebrated both his Italian roots and the American connections that had become permanent parts of his expanded, culturally enriched identity. The year 1950 found Giovanni Bellucci established as a respected figure in his Tuscan community, not only as a prosperous farmer who had successfully implemented American agricultural techniques in his traditional vineyards, but also as an informal educator, offering unique perspectives on post-war reconstruction and international cooperation. Grounded in first-hand experience with cross-cultural hospitality, his book, Prisoner in the Land of Liberty, Memories of American Redemption, had been published by a Florentine press and was gaining growing recognition as an important document on the possibilities of human reconciliation, even under the most unlikely circumstances of modern war. Maria had become an essential collaborator in his literary and educational activities, taking on international correspondence and organizing community events that promoted cultural understanding among former combatants of different nationalities. The sound of village children reciting English words during the volunteer classes Giovanni offered at the local school created a hopeful soundtrack. An investment in futures where linguistic and cultural barriers might be overcome through education and mutual curiosity. Emily Whitaker had graduated from an American university with a specialization in Italian literature and was planning a trip to Europe as part of her graduate studies. The correspondence she had maintained for years with Giovanni would finally result in a reunion, both anticipated with a mix of joy and apprehension. The familiar texture of transatlantic letters arriving monthly had become integral to family routine, each envelope carrying not only personal news but also emotional connections that kept alive an extraordinary friendship. Born during that transformative summer of 1944, the fragrance of wines Giovanni produced using hybrid techniques, combining Tuscan traditions with American fermentation methods, literally symbolized the cultural fusion that had become the hallmark of his new post-war identity. Samuel had sent additional seeds from different American wheat varieties, allowing Giovanni to establish experimental plots that drew the attention of other Italian farmers, interested in innovations that could boost the productivity and quality of their crops. Marco Antonelli had moved to Rome, where he worked at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, using his American experiences as unique qualifications for roles, requiring cultural understanding of allied countries during the period of Reconstruction and Italy's integration into post-war political and economic structures. He visited Giovanni regularly, bringing news of other former prisoners who had worked on American farms and were contributing in various ways to the modernization of Italian society through international perspectives acquired during their time abroad. The annual gatherings Giovanni organized for veterans of the American experience had become significant events, attracting journalists, scholars, and diplomats interested in studying practical examples of how authentic human interactions could overcome divisions created by political and military conflicts. The sound of Italian voices telling American stories at these meetings created a unique atmosphere where past and present blended in narratives that celebrated both survival and transformation through unexpected kindness. Giovanni had established a small museum on his property, displaying photographs, letters, farm tools, and other artifacts from his time on the Whitaker farm, a learning space that welcomed visitors from across the region interested in little-known chapters of World War II history. The worn texture of the American tools he had managed to bring home symbolized not only personal memories, but also tangible bridges between cultures that had touched briefly yet significantly during those extraordinary months. In her most recent letters, Emily wrote about her plans to study sustainable agriculture, inspired by the stories Giovanni had shared about traditional Italian techniques adaptable to American conditions, creating a two-way exchange of knowledge spanning the Atlantic. The fragrance of aromatic herbs Maria cultivated from American seeds Emily had sent mingled with the traditional scents of Tuscan gardens, creating a small sensory paradise that celebrated cultural fusion at a very intimate, personal level. Samuel had begun writing his own memoirs about the experience with Italian workers, a distinctly American perspective that would complement Giovanni's book and offer a more complete view of how that unlikely collaboration had affected both sides of the cultural and emotional equation. Emily's arrival in Tuscany in the summer of 1951 marked the culmination of 7 years of correspondence and expectation, a reunion that dramatically and satisfyingly validated the human bonds that had survived not only war, but also the time, distance, and inevitable changes that had transformed everyone involved in that extraordinary story of redemption and hospitality. Giovanni waited at the Florence train station with a nervousness he hadn't felt since his days as a prisoner of war, carrying a bouquet from his vineyards and a signed copy of his book, symbolic gifts for the young American who had become a daughter in spirit through years of letters and shared memories. Emily stepped off the train like a figure both familiar and transformed. Now a 23-year-old woman with a university education and cosmopolitan poise, yet still bearing in her blue eyes the same curiosity and kindness that had defined the teenager who offered homemade bread to enemy soldiers 7 years earlier. The sound of fluent Italian from her lips as she greeted him created a moment of emotional fulfillment, confirming the lasting value of the educational and emotional investments both had made in a friendship that transcended conventional categories of human relationships. Maria and Giovanni's sons, now teenagers who had grown up on stories about the American Whitaker family, welcomed Emily as if she were a blood relative, returning after a long absence rather than a foreigner visiting for the first time. The familiar yet emotionally charged feel of the embrace Giovanni and Emily shared symbolized not only a personal reunion, but also the validation of hopes and dreams that had sustained them through years of geographic separation. The scent of French perfume Emily wore mingled with Tuscan aromas of vineyards and olive groves, creating an olfactory symphony that marked the beginning of a visit that would become legendary in the Bellucci family's history. Samuel had sent a special letter through Emily, containing recent photographs of the Kansas farm and news of changes since the departure of the Italian workers, sustaining a connection that had become a shared emotional heritage between two families on different continents. The week Emily spent at the Bellucci property was filled with activities that celebrated both continuity and change, allowing her to experience firsthand the Italian traditions Giovanni had described in his letters, while observing how American techniques had been adapted and integrated into ancestral agricultural practices. Giovanni led detailed tours of his vineyards, explaining in improved English how irrigation methods learned in Kansas had increased his vine's productivity without compromising the traditional quality of the Tuscan wines his family had produced for generations. Emily took an active part in the grape harvest, her delicate hands learning to select ripe fruit with the same attention to detail she had once watched Giovanni apply to the American wheat harvest during that distant yet memorable summer. The WWII sound of bilingual conversation at family meals created a cosmopolitan atmosphere that pleasantly contrasted with the rural simplicity of the Tuscan village, demonstrating how cultures can enrich one another without losing their essential identities. Maria prepared special dishes combining traditional Italian recipes with ingredients and techniques Emily suggested from her American background, creating culinary fusions that perfectly symbolize the cultural hybridization characterizing the entire transatlantic friendship. The texture of homemade pasta, made with hybrid wheat grown from Kansas seed, offered a literal, flavorful example of how international collaboration can produce results surpassing any single contribution. Emily photographed the property extensively, either vineyards, the family, and especially the small museum Giovanni had created to preserve memories of his American experience, producing visual documentation that would complement her own written and academic reflections on this extraordinary visit. The fragrance of new wines fermenting in the cellars blended with the aromas of homemade Italian food to create a sensory environment Emily would later describe as paradise found, in letters to Samuel about finally knowing Italy through the eyes and heart of the family that had become essential to her personal story and intellectual growth. The collaborative project Giovanni and Emily developed during her visit resulted in ambitious plans to establish a formal agricultural and cultural exchange between Tuscany and Kansas, leveraging their personal connections and academic credentials to create institutional opportunities that could benefit future generations of farmers and students in both countries. Emily had brought preliminary documents from American universities interested in partnering with Italian institutions for comparative studies of Mediterranean and continental agriculture, proposals Giovanni welcomed enthusiastically, offering support through his connections with Tuscan agricultural cooperatives and regional educational authorities. Marco Antonelli, who had traveled from Rome specifically to meet Emily, contributed the bureaucratic and diplomatic expertise needed to navigate the legal and administrative complexities of international agreements, turning personal dreams into practical possibilities implementable on realistic timelines. The sound of intense planning during long evening conversations on the Bellucci porch created a hopeful soundtrack, echoing with future possibilities born of present friendships and past memories of successful collaboration. Giovanni proposed that the program include not only technical agricultural exchanges, but also cultural components, allowing American and Italian participants to develop deeper understanding of history, art, language, and traditions, enriching their personal and professional perspectives. The texture of official documents Emily and Giovanni prepared together symbolize the transition from purely personal relationships to institutional initiatives capable of impacting hundreds of people over the decades to come. Emily promised to use her master's thesis on cultural interactions in POW work programs as the academic foundation for funding proposals to sustain the exchange program they envisioned. The fragrance of fresh ink on preliminary agreements mingled with the night aromas of Tuscan gardens, creating an atmosphere celebrating both present achievements and future potentials that could sprout from the seeds planted during that extraordinary week of collaboration and renewed friendship, bonds that had survived remarkable tests of time, distance, and circumstance. The end of Emily's visit was marked by farewell ceremonies, honoring both the historical significance of her reunion with Giovanni and the future promises they had made to continue building bridges between their cultures through educational work and institutional collaboration. The Bellucci family organized a farewell party in the village that drew dozens of neighbors curious about the young American who had become a local legend through Giovanni's stories of kindness received during his captivity in Kansas. Emily gave a public presentation in Italian about her impressions of Tuscany and her plans to promote cultural exchange between Italy and America, demonstrating not only impressive linguistic competence, but also cultural sensitivity that won the admiration and respect of an audience initially skeptical of a foreigner's motives for visiting their rural region. The sound of enthusiastic applause when Emily finished confirmed that she had forged genuine connections extending far beyond her individual visit, planting seeds of curiosity and cultural openness likely to influence community attitudes for years to come. Giovanni presented Emily with special gifts, symbolizing both Italian tradition and cultural innovation. A bottle of wine produced from hybrid grapes grown using American techniques, a volume of Tuscan poetry signed by local poets, and a small olive wood sculpture of interlaced hands, symbolizing enduring international friendship. The smooth surface of the wooden sculpture Emily held, moved, symbolized traditional Italian art infused with contemporary meanings about cooperation and mutual understanding among different peoples. Maria had prepared a special basket containing local artisanal products, Italian vegetable seeds, and letters from other village residents who wished to establish their own correspondences with Americans interested in learning about Italian culture. Emily promised to distribute these cultural gifts in her American community, creating networks of connection that could endlessly multiply the positive influences of her Italian experience. The fragrance of dried herbs and traditional spices permeating Emily's gifts would create lasting scent memories, linking her sensorially to Tuscany throughout the years of her life and career. The final embrace between Giovanni and Emily at the Florence train station lasted long minutes, both aware they were concluding an extraordinary chapter of their lives, while also beginning new chapters that would honor and expand the legacy of humanity, hospitality, and hope born in that distant summer when wartime enemies discovered they could become chosen family through shared work, mutual respect, and a courageous openness to possibilities of redemption that transcended all the artificial divisions created by politics, nationalism, and war.